Chapter 8. Corlia. 721 years before the current era. To transform Estolia from an uninhabited island into the paradise we know nearly 3,000 years later, took an equal measure of both deity and luck. Looking back, it seems as if those events happened in a systematic pre-planned progression of fortuitous coincidences. Rationally, however, the first immigrants were fleeing poverty and servitude, seeking their fortune, and fertile fields not yet claimed by the wealthy and powerful. In addition, craftsmen, herd masters, workers of metal, stonemasons, and the seafarers whose passion was the beating heart of Estolia, these all found their way to Estolia's shores. Those who came to Estolia learned of the promise that Zacharias made to deity and embraced the Estolian faith. Meredith Zakarian, History of Estolia. The small fire crackled merrily. Sebastian stared into the flames and reflected on the time since he left Palmyra. 10 years had elapsed since Groban released him and gave him his stallion Migo. Since his arrival on the small island, he always made certain he faced the direction of the rising sun, looking across the intervening water towards Palmyra, the land that held all that was dear to his heart, Corella's final resting place and his son. He came upon this island during his most recent adventure. He'd been hired to tend to the needs of 10 mares. Transported from the farthest reaches of Centrath, they had been escorted by a handful of individuals. Sebastian was hired to escort the mares to the royal stables in Novellas. A gift from one man in power to another. The island's inhabitants were goats, sheep and wild horses. The horses on the small island resembled Corlian's first steed, short in stature, but in all other ways perfectly proportional. He named the island Corlia, in honor of his son. It was a privilege to see to the needs of the broodmares. Their value, in the mind of Shikan Sharon, was beyond price. For the royal stablemaster of Novellas, they were a peculiar obligation he was required to humor. On the third day of the journey, the captain's disdain for equine transportation, and horses in general, became apparent. The feed was moldy and caked in the feces and urine of rodents. Sebastian confronted the captain, but his concerns were ignored. His insistence did eventually elicit a response. Migo woke him, and it took him several minutes to figure out what had happened. The sweet breath of the stallion filled his senses as his equine companion nudged him, trying to get him to stand up. He climbed unsteadily to his feet, leaning heavily on the stallion. Migo moved closer, whickering in concern even as his muscles bunched to help support Sebastian. He recalled the captain punching him. The captain and another man had dragged him to Migo's stall, and then, seeing the whip amongst Sebastian's possessions, the two men took turns whipping him until he passed out. His jaw was broken. It was a full week before Sebastian could tend his charges. When one of the mares lost her premature foal and died shortly thereafter, he came to a decision. They were passing by a small island where Sebastian chose to risk everything. He led the mares, weak from starvation and dehydration, to a break in the deck rail. With a quick prayer to the 7 deities, he urged the frightened mares into the water. He was just leading Migo towards the rail when the captain stepped out of the bridge. He crossed his arms and leaned back, his teeth flashing in the light of the full moon. Without hesitation, he mounted Migo, and urged him into the water. On Palmyra, Sebastian sought out Devrin once he healed, so that he might learn everything he could about the substances used on him, asphodel and calumnin, and he became expert at treating injuries, especially his own. The healing skills he learned were essential in the aftermath of his recent mistreatment. He would remain for a season, heal from his wounds, and recharge his soul. He had learned, over the course of the years, to accept physical pain and set it aside. He had been alone on the island for more than a full cycle of the moon, and had found a measure of peace in his solitude. He tossed some pine cones on the fire, harvesting the pine nuts absent-mindedly as he leaned back against the grassy hummock. Corlian would number 15 years on the next day. Sebastian could only imagine what his son's life was like. He would have 2 or 3 siblings by now. Dumeril would be teaching him everything he knew about horses. One of the pieces of wood in the fire broke, sending up a miniature burst of sparks. He clenched his jaw, remembering that Corlia was Dumeril's son. His son would not remember him. The sky was clear and the stars looked like gems sparkling in pure, undiluted darkness. The jeweled expanse led him to muse about wounds. The stars might be considered wounds to the darkness, an interruption in the preferred state of being. The night sky, being infinite, must therefore have infinite wounds to contend with. He chuckled to himself. He was no philosopher. Unlike the night sky, he had but 2 wounds to his soul: Corella and Corlia. More than once he dreamed of conversing with deity, and learning that Corella would wait for him in the life after this life. Corlia was living, and in a few years, most likely loving in Palmyra. He could probably return to Palmyra and see his son. But, even if he could secure passage back to the land of his birth, the gap that separated them was insurmountable. Corlia thought of himself as Dumeril's son, and Sebastian had to accept the final barrier, the one he could not overcome. It was the will of deity that he seek his son only in the life after this life. Until that time, he would live his life in the service of the 7 deities of Centrath. "You have been very faithful, Sebastian," a female voice spoke next to him. For just a moment, he thought he was seeing Corella. But it wasn't her. It was a stranger. The moon was just rising, and her hair was a light color. The details of her features and garments weren't visible in the darkness. "I am deity, Sebastian. I commanded that you must leave Corlia. Do you regret the years since?" Deity? Unable to decipher his thoughts or feelings. "Perhaps, Sebastian, it is a courtesy. I could look within, but I do you the honor of asking you to share with me." His heartbeat accelerated. She must be deity. She could see within his heart. What had she asked? Did he regret the 10 years since he last saw his son? "I have traveled far, learned much, become more than I would have been had I remained. I feel an emptiness within me. Like a tooth that aches but becomes an expected companion, always with me. Would I trade the last 10 years for those same years serving Groban? No. I have found great peace within myself for who I am. This life is not so long, I will be with Corella again. I wish more of you, Sebastian, than you have so far given." "How may I serve you?" The time he spent here, in the land he called Corlia, had been a time of peace and rejuvenation. A time to get to know himself more than he ever had before. But it was a time of solitude. He could not remain here indefinitely. Her tinkling laughter reverberated through the night, but she did not share whatever amused her. To the southwest is a rocky strait. Impossible to navigate in a vessel that plies the water, but you and your stallion can cross it. If you turn to the south and travel along the shore as it curves to the west until you come to a purple river, you will find that your services, as my servant, are needed. He thought about her words for some time. Finally, he turned to ask her a question, only to find that he was alone. He lay down and closed his eyes, thinking about the woman, the deity he had just conversed with. She had read his mind, responded to him as if he spoke aloud. He had to believe. On the morrow, he would seek out those who required his services as a servant of deity. When they finished fording the impassable rocky strait that separated Corlia and the larger island to the west, Migu tugged frequently at the reins until finally Sebastian felt constrained to give him his head. For most of the morning they alternated between a canter on the smoothest terrain to a ground-eating trot on the rougher parts of the seashore. Long after he would have rested his stallion, the animal kept up the grueling pace. Was deity providing the stallion with the stamina required to complete this task? With the sun balanced on the edge of the world, surrounded by clouds kindling in the reflected glory of its brilliance, the impetus seemed to drain away, and they halted to watch the celestial show. That night Sebastian slept well, comforted by the sound of Migu grazing. The sun was still below the edge of the world when he woke to the nudge of Migu's nose, urging him awake. After his morning ablutions, he mounted the stallion and they continued their journey by the light of an almost full moon. The sun was just peeping over the horizon, lighting up the new day, when he discovered the Purple River. On the far side was just a barren shelf of land teeming with big seabirds and very little vegetation. To the south was the outlet to the sea, which left only one direction to travel, upriver, to find those who had a need of his services. The sky was still painted with the muted colors of sunrise when Migu pushed through some brush and Sebastian spied two people enjoying the glorious colors of the fading skies. He called out a greeting to them. These were the individuals whom deity asked him to seek out, the ones who required the services he could provide. The man spoke to him in Enochian, the language of commerce in Western Centrath. The sun was not far above the horizon when Sebastian formalized their union. Zacharias and Estoliana were their names, and by the midday meal, they had invited him to make his home, permanently, in Estolia.